Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to a discussion about double-edged sword albums. This is part one. There will be a part two to this, so keep an eye out for that. But bands and musicians are always looking to hit it big, have a lot of success and so forth. And if they were big at one time, they're usually trying to re-achieve that success in some way. And that can result in any number of ways: member changes, reinventing their sound, and a whole lot more. But with that success often comes a double-edged sword by which the band becomes defined for the rest of their career. So join me as I run through 10 such albums like that, double-edged sword albums. Part one, remember there will be a part two to that, and we'll get into all of this here in just a bit. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episode discussion topics just like this with double-edged sword albums, part one. All right, so for this one here, we're going to cover letters A through J, and then in part two, we'll pick up with K and go through the rest of the alphabet. But starting things here, we are going to go with Aerosmith, Permanent Vacation, 1987, ninth studio album from the band. It was the second one on Geffen Records, their new label, and it marked a predominant shift to the sound at the time, the glam metal sound that was really big going on. And you know, while it returned them to their previous successes and so forth, that the last couple albums had been underperforming, only going gold, this one here ultimately had 3 mega hits off of it and would sell 5 million copies. But the thing is, that sound change alienated a lot of the older fans from the 70s that were looking for that straight ahead hard rock sound, where now the band had more of a glam metal sound. And so you've got that catch-22 in there where it gave them their success, but it also divided their fan base, creating that double-edged sword type of album for them. All right, next one. Asia, self-titled release from 1982, debut studio album for the supergroup that featured Yes, ELP, and King Crimson members. And the album itself featured a number 4 Billboard Hot 100 hit in Heat of the Moment, and ultimately making it their biggest selling album, going on to sell 4 million copies in the US. Now, the thing is, this being their first album, it wasn't anything that the fans could be comparing it to at this point, but for the rest of the career for Asia, the band would constantly be trying to re-achieve this and always being compared to it and having trouble in terms of that regard moving forward. All right, next one here, Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell from 1980, 9th studio album from the band, first to feature new vocalist Ronnie James Dio, coming from Rainbow and Elf and a number of others. But you know, like with any band that changes its members, the fans, or there's just some of them that can't move on. And the album, you know, having the new lineup and even a new sound with it for the 80s, ultimately provided some new blood for the band, some new life, reinvigorating them and so forth. But it wasn't the Black Sabbath that a lot of the older fans had grown up with in that sound, creating an issue where a lot of the fans would only be interested in the Ozzy era of the lineup versus the fans were willing to move forward. And of course, the band would go through many, many more member changes after this, ultimately where fans continued to cry out for Ozzy to return to the fold. And again, it's just another one of those things, you know, it's a catch-22. It gave them that new life, but it also created a division within the arc of the fans. Next one, Def Leppard, Hysteria, 1987, 4th studio album. This one here completed their transition that they had been doing for the last couple albums from that more new wave of British heavy metal sound into a more pop metal or even glam metal sound. Now the thing is, this album here featured 7 bona fide hits on it. It became their biggest selling album, 12 million copies sold in the US, with an estimated 25 million copies sold around the world. And the thing is, though, it really did split the fan base, where fans felt that they had lost that hard rock edge from the first three albums, and they were now into this more polished sort of sound. And the thing is, while it did split the fans, and certainly there are ones who did not want to continue on with the band, and I still hear that today, even when talking about current releases from Def Leppard, this new album brought in droves and droves of fans at the time. And so you now have this split where it's the people that want that very early sound of Def Leppard, or fans that want the sound from Hysteria. And even the band has tried, not really sure whether they want to replicate or distance themselves from it. So it's really dogged them going forward in their career. I think only in recent years, from about the 2015 on, have the band really accepted what it is that Hysteria did for them and owning up to it and so forth. Next one, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, 1977, 11th studio album from the band. This was the second one to feature the new lineup that now included Stevie Nicks on vocals and Lindsey Buckingham also on vocals and guitar. And while the fans seem to welcome the new lineup with open arms, of course, there's always those ones that will miss the original members. And the album itself would ultimately become mega huge for the band itself, completely overshadowing and dwarfing anything that the band had done prior to this. The album itself would sell 20 million copies just in the US alone, with an estimated 40 million copies around the world, making it one of the all-time greatest selling records ever of any genre. And while the band had always changed members, this is their 11th studio album, they had changed members like every couple albums, it seemed like. Bringing in, Stevie and Lindsey here was nothing new, but going forward after this, the band would find it a lot harder to be able to change out Lindsey or Stevie, and finding that there would be far less interest in the band if they did, including a drop in album sales and concert ticket sales. Okay, next one. Peter Gabriel, So, from 1986, fifth studio album from him. Now, he had previously established himself as frontman for Genesis back in the early 70s, when progressive rock was, king of the charts and all of that sort of stuff. And while he had gone solo in 1977, this was now the 1980s, and like many other artists that were from the 70s coming into the 80s, he went ahead and simplified his sound, dropping off a lot of the experimentation and so forth, but he did maintain outside and various musical influences in his music. And the thing that would now happen with this is creating this sort of pop album masterpiece that he did here. He would be forever compared to this, including the stuff going forward beyond this. It would just become the ultimate thing that Peter Gabriel is now known for, this mega album, and even the mega hit that was on here, Sledgehammer. Ultimately, the album would sell 5 million copies and be his biggest selling album. So again, bringing him to that ultimate level of success, but becoming the thing that everyone would define him for. Next album up here from his cohorts, Genesis, Invisible Touch, 1986, 13th studio album. Interesting that this album and So from Peter Gabriel came out at the same time and ultimately became the biggest albums by both bands and the biggest ones that the bands then would be sort of judged on. So with Genesis in this album, they were originally a 5-piece back in the 70s during the prog heyday and so forth. But again, this was the 80s. They were down to the core 3 guys. And like bands with, Asia and Yes, who had simplified the sounds down to a more pop-friendly style, shorter songs, keeping complexity within there, but they were much shorter and more digestible. This would ultimately break them open to a much bigger audience than they had had previous to this, and helping the album become their biggest selling album with 6 million copies. But like for Peter Gabriel, this became the album that a lot of fans associate with the band and the thing they expect to hear from the band no matter what they did. And the 2 albums that would subsequently come after this were very much compared to this. Ultimately, Genesis hasn't done anything in a very long time, since the early 90s to mid 90s, but still the thing that, as I said, most fans define the band for. All right, next one up, we've got another debut album here, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction, 1987, debut studio album, as I said. This one here, at the time, has become one of the biggest selling debut rock albums, selling 18 million copies in the US, 30 million worldwide on it, going on to define the sound of the band, much like Asia in their debut album that we talked about. They didn't have really anything prior to this for fans to compare them to, other than the live EP, Live Like a Suicide. But as studio material, and for what most people knew, it was just this. But going forward, because this was such a massive success, and fans now look to this album for over 35 years as what they want the band to sound like. But even in 88, 91, and so forth, with the release of other albums and material, the fans have just never quite let down their desire to have another Appetite for Destruction type sound, and consequently it's what they've been compared to going forward. So they have the massive success out of the gate, but it's something that the fans can't let go of. The band has done a lot of great things and huge things since then, but everybody always harkens back to Appetite. Next one up, Heart, self-titled release from 1985, 8th studio album. As with a lot of the 70s rock bands moving into the 80s, the band looked to reinvent themselves to try to get that success back that they had had from the 70s. For this, the band and or maybe the label brought in outside writers to assist in this, and it created a much more pop-friendly sound than what they had been doing with the hard rock of the 70s and so forth. But it did lead to massive hits off of this album, and ultimately taking the album sales to 5 million copies sold in the US. But for those that wanted to hear Ann and Nancy Wilson's writings on the rock sounds of the 70s and that sort of stuff, that was very little bit of that on this album. As I said, most of it was outside songwriters. The band themselves only wrote or co-wrote a few of the tracks that were on here. And so while the album did reinvigorate the band for big success throughout the 80s, when the 80s abruptly ended at the end of the decade, so did the sound and the style and so forth, and then so did Heart's success as well. Now, the band hasn't really been trying to recreate this ever since, but I think that they've been in sort of a limbo, not really knowing where to go with the 70s rock sound, the 80s sound, and they've even tried some new things going forward, just none of it really working for the band. All right, and the final one that we're talking about as part of part one here, Judas Priest, Turbo from 1986, 10th studio album from the band. Notable in its shift from the more traditional metal of previous album, Defenders of the Faith, 1984, which had a lot of metal anthems on it, to the more pop metal, glam metal sounds that were dominating the charts at the time. This was a big shock to a lot of the diehard Judas Priest fans. But, like with anything, it brought a slew of newer fans in, eager to check out the band, mostly due to the title track, Turbo Lover, which is still a major hit for the band today, played on radio all over the place, and played live and so forth. It's something that they can't get away from. So while the album itself alienated a lot of fans at the time for that more pop metal friendly sound, it is the thing that broadened the horizons of what the band could do and so forth, and led to extra success for them before they ultimately would return to that heavier sound on Ram It Down, and ultimately Painkiller, a true defining album in their career. But there you go. Hopefully you have enjoyed this part one for the Double-Edged Sword albums. We're going to pick up with part 2 in the next round of this, and we'll cover letters K through Z. So make sure you do check back for that. But right now, let me know your thoughts on letters A through J that we just ran through here. I'm sure there's some other great bands and albums that were, you know, defining albums, but ultimately double-edged swords that both gave them success and yet took from them at the same time.